And I'm going to start on my left, and that is Jean-Marie Guéhenno. He is a former French diplomat. He was an Undersecretary General for Peacekeeping for a number of years, I think 8 years, 9 years. And he then became the CEO of the International Crisis Group, and he's now the chairman of the board of the Humanitarian Dialogue, among many other functions that he has. And I should say he's also a very good colleague. We served together in the United Nations, so that's very good memories. Just like his neighbor, and that is Ambassador Che Young-jin. He is also a Korean diplomat, and he served as ambassador to the US and was the former special representative of the Secretary General for the Côte d'Ivoire when we knew him. So welcome to you. And the last one, the last panelist is Thomas Biersteker. He's the professor of international security at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, Switzerland. And he also has been working on advising the United Nations Secretariat and the governments on Switzerland, Sweden and Germany on the design of targeted sanctions. He's quite an expert. He's written recently a big study, plus also other publications on sanctions. And because he will give a more general overview of the sanctions issue, he will start out the presentations. So I would like to ask you, he has to use the podium because we're having a little technical issue, so he will start speaking at this podium. So the floor is yours, Thomas.
Yes, sorry for the formality of standing behind a podium like this, but I guess I'm used to it since I am usually lecturing in the university setting. So I'll not make this a lecture. I'll make this as policy relevant as I possibly can. And I want to some extent, make a slight change. And if you read the program, it said we're going to focus on issues. We're going to focus on issues related to the effectiveness of sanctions. I'm happy to talk about that, and I will have one slide on it. But I really want to shift the focus to, I think, a somewhat more interesting question: not do sanctions work, but how do sanctions interact with other policy instruments? And it draws on some recent research that Angela just mentioned, that I'll say something more about. And therefore, I've shifted the focus a bit here to talk about sanctions relief options, the way in which the promise of or the offer of some types of sanctions relief could possibly be useful in breaking the deadlock in negotiations. First, let me, I don't know where to point this. Here? Now I need technical assistance. There we go. Okay, sorry. First, let me just, in context, say something about the exceptional nature of the United Nations sanctions on the DPRK. This is currently the most extensive sanctions regime that the UN has in place. There are currently 15 sanctions regimes in operation at the UN. But this is by far the most extensive. Most sanctions regimes are extremely targeted, typically targeting individuals, several corporate entities, firms, and perhaps in some cases a sector of the economy. The DPRK sanctions at the moment, the UN sanctions on the DPRK, are approximating comprehensive sanctions. They include financial sector measures, petroleum import restrictions, limitations on significant sources of revenue from the export of coal and remittances from workers abroad, and the application of financial sector sanctions and sanctions on oil and other oil are non-discriminating measures. That is, they're not targeted in the sense because they affect the entire population in the country. We've actually developed a sanctions discrimination scale on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being the most targeted, 1 to 6, sorry, 6 being comprehensive sanctions. We've currently ranked in our latest evaluation the DPRK sanctions 5 on a scale of 6, just as I said a moment ago, approximating comprehensive sanctions. Now, the UN sanctions are also accompanied by additional measures that are applied by both the US and the European Union. Second, one slide briefly on sanctions effectiveness. The DPRK is a least likely case for sanctions effectiveness. This is because it's very difficult to use sanctions to try to change behavior. In fact, in the studies we did as part of the Targeted Sanctions Consortium between 2009 and 2016, we found that UN sanctions were effective in changing behavior of targets only 10% of the time. So coercion is a low probability outcome. constraining actors is somewhat less challenging, but increasing costs doesn't necessarily lead to major cuts in North Korea's existing programs, either nuclear programs or missile defense programs. And of course, North Korea has a history of autonomous, self-reliant development, Juche. And with that system, it's automatically less susceptible to external restrictive measures. And the nature of the state, this is one of the last remaining command economies. And it's much easier for a command economy to determine who benefits and who loses from sanctions than a less command economy. Therefore, it's a perfect illustration of what we would call the sanctions paradox. Sanctions are more effective on highly integrated economies, but they're less likely to be applied on those economies. Hence, the low frequency of success in sanctions. But I'm happy to elaborate on this in much more detail if anyone's interested later. One point from our research on sanctions over the last decade or so we've emphasized is that sanctions have multiple purposes. Most people focus on, and I've already given you illustrations of this, sanctions are designed or often to change behavior, to coerce a change in behavior. But sanctions, all sanctions regimes, not all, but most, have multiple purposes. In fact, not only are they most frequently intended to coerce, but at the same time, they may be efforts to constrain and, in all cases, I would argue, to signal both the target and others. So if we apply this to the DPRK, the signal is not just to North Korea, but it's also to the rest of the world about non-participation in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I'm the principal developer of something called Sanctions App. It's available online if anyone's interested. It's free. We do annual evaluations of the effectiveness of all UN sanctions, all 25 sanctions regimes going back to 1990. And we also have done evaluations on DPRK as of last year. If you look at the app, you'll see the purposes, I'll just apply them now, are to coerce DPRK to denuclearize and return to the NPT. They're also intended to constrain North Korea from developing nuclear and missile technology programs, and to signal both the DPRK and others about the importance of the non-proliferation regime. So here's just the application of the different purposes and the way in which it's related to how we, at least if related, I again can come back to how we evaluate it. To make it short, ineffective, ineffective, effective is our current evaluation. But I really want to focus on the relationship between sanctions and mediation efforts. And here I'm going to draw on a recent project that's actually still underway. We're in our second phase now with support from the government of Switzerland to look at the relationship between UN sanctions and UN mediation efforts. Because United Nations sanctions and mediation, it's not a trade-off. In fact, we've found that in 90% of the cases when the United Nations applies sanctions, it also has either mediation role or there are active negotiations underway. So there's not a choice between sanctions and negotiation. The two are simultaneously being applied in most cases. And so we developed a project jointly with the UN University and with the Swiss NGO Swiss Peace, a mediation NGO in Switzerland, to look at the relationship between sanctions and mediation. And I think this has important implications for the discussions about the negotiations between the DPRK, the United States, and the critical role, of course, of the Republic of Korea. Now, it's interesting, within the UN system, we found that mediators tend to distance themselves from sanctions for a couple of reasons. One, because they need to maintain their impartiality, but also because they want to avoid association with coercive instruments. And so this can lead to situations of complete dysfunctionality. In fact, sanctions can clearly complicate mediation efforts. I mentioned Yemen in 2015 because Jamal Ben Ammar, the UN mediator, reached a negotiated settlement between the Hadi government and the Houthis the very same day the United Nations applied sanctions on the Houthi side exclusively, and the agreement fell apart. So clearly sanctions and mediation don't always work well together. At the same time, however, sanctions can also complement mediation and negotiation efforts. There's just a shameless plug for our recent report, also free. You can get this on the UNU website or the Graduate Institute website. This is just our recent report just released in New York, February of this year. But I want to talk about practical questions about how to think about using sanctions relief as a tool for bargaining, because we found that the suspension of sanctions, not the lifting or termination, but just their temporary suspension, or the promise of offering an exemption or future potential lifting can break deadlocks in critical situations. Libya in the 1990s, if you look at what triggered the Libyan government's decision to extradite 2 Libyan nationals to a Scottish court in The Hague, it was the suspension of the UN sanctions measures in the 90s. It was quite critical for that decision. Former Yugoslavia, Richard Holbrooke offered Slobodan Milosevic, if we'll lift the oil embargo on the former Yugoslavia or on Serbia and Montenegro, if you agree to come to Dayton. Another example. Afghanistan, quite recently, Hekmatyar broke with the Taliban over the promise of being delisted by the UN. And we could also talk about Iran and the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action as being an example, again, of ways in which the idea, the promise of the potential of lifting sanctions was quite critical in the negotiation of that agreement. Sanctions, therefore, should not only be considered as an impediment, but in fact a potential tool for conflict resolution. And that's really the larger picture that I'm trying to paint. And now I'll try to apply this directly to the DPRK. And more generally, I would say the UN sanctions are targeted, so use them as targeted measures. They're not comprehensive sanctions. It's not an all or nothing proposition. They're incredibly extensive, but that gives you a large menu of possibilities for negotiations. So sanctions as a bargaining tool, let me say briefly that we've also discovered that sanctions are more effective as a bargaining instrument than they are as a tool of pressure. I've already mentioned that we only find 10% of the sanctions effective in coercing changes in behavior. But sanctions suspensions are oftentimes more significant. Having them and then offering to lift them is more important in bargaining than their initial imposition. Of course, the other side works as well with regard to threats. But suspension carries a very significant, powerful symbolic value in many cases, because countries don't like being sanctioned. They don't like being sanctioned by the United Nations in particular, because it's a condemnation of your peers in general. So I would argue one should approach the bargaining process as a coordinated tit-for-tat strategy, basically offering calibrated sanctions relief, not lifting the sanctions by no means at the outset, but offering a calibrated something, a carrot on the table, in exchange for tangible denuclearization options or measures. And it's also interesting to focus on the UN sanctions in contrast with Iran, because in the Iran case, the principal sanctions that really mattered were the application of sanctions by the European Union, starting in 2010 and escalating quite rapidly in 2012. In the DPRK case, the UN sanctions are more central, because the UN sanctions have applicability in 2 permanent members, China, of course, and Russia being critical, but China obviously much more critical. That means that DPRK is more affected by the UN sanctions than it is by the autonomous measures applied by the US and the EU. There are 3 different categories. There are many. I have 4 pages of lists of categories that are prohibited. I'm not going to present that by any means. But there are 3 broad types of sanctions being applied by the United Nations on the DPRK. First, there are outright prohibitions. This is prohibitions on proliferation-related goods, on arms imports, arms exports, on coal exports, long-standing ban on luxury goods imports. So these are direct prohibitions. That's usually what we think of when we think about sanctions. But the UN Security Council has been somewhat more creative with DPRK and has come up with what we call conditional measures. These are measures particularly applied with regard to vessel seizure, inspection, and impounding, where a member state is, if it has reason to suspect that a vessel is carrying embargoed goods, it is legally responsible to board, inspect, and impound those goods. So it's a conditional measure that's up to the discretion of individual member states. That's an innovation in terms of types of sanctions. It also, of course, like many sanctions regimes, has additional or optional measures. And these are measures like secondary sanctions on firms or individuals facilitating financial services, since there's a ban on financial services. So this is 3 different types of measures. Now, again, with regard to utility and negotiation, this gives potential negotiators a large menu of options. And so what I want to do is talk about, I've got 3 slides on menus of possibilities here. And I'll start with the least intrusive, the slightest of things that could be done. but also the ones that provide the least guarantees to all parties. Let me start with simply relaxation of implementation. Now, one might say cynically, many states relaxed their implementation of Chapter 7 legally binding Security Council resolutions, but if you simply said, well, relax the optional limitation on diplomatic staff, but make sure you follow the monitoring team's latest recommendation in its report issued just in February or March this year. Make sure that banks know who those people are. And limit the application of secondary sanctions. I was here a couple of years ago talking about what more could be done, and I said, well, the only thing additional that you could do at this stage is more actively go after the evaders, and that's, of course, another strategy if you want to ratchet the sanctions up rather than relax them. Exemptions. Let me move to the next sort of category here. Most UN Security Council resolutions offer exemptions, virtually all do, for humanitarian purposes. So you could exempt the transfer of fishing rights under the seafood ban. You could do a partial extension of that. You could create a safe banking channel for humanitarian goods. I was just in New York earlier this month meeting with bankers and the sanctions branch, talking about the challenge, because the United Nations, and some of you may have seen the report that came out, was I think issued via UN Wire today from the Human Rights Council, on the humanitarian situation in the north. We had a presentation from OCHA saying basically UN humanitarian actors cannot get financing for the delivery of goods into North Korea. So the financial ban is having, even though, of course, humanitarian actors are exempted, but in application, they're not getting the financing to get the goods there. So this is another set of options that is available. Going on, another creative innovation with the DPRK sanctions is the introduction of caps. Traditionally, when there's a sectoral sanction, an entire sector is blocked. But in the DPRK case, there are limitations. So 500,000 barrels of imported petroleum is allowed, but no more. And those of you who may follow the latest Security Council debates on this, there's a little bit of a tussle in terms of between the US and Russia on this issue about whether or not the DPRK has exceeded that 500,000 barrel limit last year, not this year. It probably happened already this year. So what you could do is you could simply raise the cap, or if you wanted to tighten the sanction, you could lower the cap. So here's another set of adjustments that one could put on a menu of options. Or you could raise the cap again for sanctions relief. You could raise the cap on the number of work authorizations for DPRK nationals. So these are adjustments of caps. And then we thought, well, if you could adjust the caps, then why not introduce them in others? So you could introduce caps which would convert a general ban of all coal exports to a partial or limited ban. So this again creates, you could do this with coal, you could do this with seafood, you could do this with textiles. So these are all different options. And again, this is a rich menu. Most sanctions regimes don't offer this kind of menu because they're relatively restricted and narrow regimes. And then going further down, you could offer temporary suspensions. I've already mentioned how significant suspensions were in Libya over the Libyan regime's downing of the Pan Am and UTA flights in the late 89 and 90. So you could, but with suspensions, you could lift or suspend, not lift sanctions, but simply suspend the application of the measures temporarily on individuals or corporate entities. You could do the same thing for sectoral measures. You could engage in selective delistings. Now we're getting up to a higher degree. Now these are actually taking people off the list, but right now there are 80 individuals and 75 corporate entities on the UN list. So you could make a selective delisting. And then, of course, finally, you could do lifting or formal termination of sanctions. Now, I'm giving all of these options because it's not a matter of sanctions yes, no, sanctions relief. It's not a binary. There's an extraordinarily rich menu of things that could be chosen and could be applied in what would undoubtedly be a very long, extended negotiation process. Let me just conclude with some reference, 2 more points. Technical feasibility, this isn't very hard to do. We don't need new technical language to apply many of these measures. It turns out the UN has already passed Security Council resolutions in previously agreed resolutions on Angola and in Liberia, which actually give you the language for a temporary suspension of existing measure. There's no need to negotiate a complex snapback option as in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on Iran. And it would be difficult to do that, particularly today, with growing great power disagreement and gridlock on the Security Council. that's the technical feasibility. The political feasibility is a good deal more difficult, and here's quite a different matter. And here's where I'll turn to the other panelists to look for insights about what is or what might be done, because it is rather difficult and fraught with high politics at the moment. But it's important to note that the major expansion of the sanctions on the DPRK, which took place just a few years ago, starting in 2016 up to the present, has been undertaken in resolutions jointly authored by the United States and China. And I think that's quite significant for the larger political framework of this. And the 5 sanctions resolutions that were mentioned by the DPRK foreign minister at the end of the Hanoi summit have all been passed since 2015. So we're talking about this very recent period of intense cooperation with China, between China and the U.S. Of course, there is the problem of what I call institutionalized uncertainty in the White House today, but that's something that I don't wish to talk about. I'm sure it'll come up at some point. But a couple of strategic points, and I'll just conclude here. First, one has to make an assessment of what are the most salient sanctions for the regime, and if you want to make an effective offer. And this is very difficult. We can distinguish between high value, medium, and low value, but that's a somewhat arbitrary assessment, and it's hard to get different sides to reveal their preferences. Determine what your top priorities are in denuclearization, and then try to match the two, keeping in mind, as I said, both sides will try not to reveal their preferences. And then, of course, a sequencing plan would need to be developed. So these are just very general ideas. I've given you the menu. I've given you now some of the technical features, but this is just part of the introduction of the strategy. It would make sense, of course, to introduce confidence-building measures. There's a long list. I can elaborate on that later if you wish, that could be accompanying sanctions relief operations. But broadly thinking, I think one should look not to the Libya model, as has been suggested by some, Mr. Bolton among others, but look to the Iran, the JCPOA, as a model. And here the choice is, do you pre-negotiate everything and set out a roadmap, as in the JCPOA, or do you take a more incremental step-by-step approach, a more open-ended approach? Now, obviously, the open-ended approach has much more uncertainty, but it might be more pragmatically appropriate in this particular situation. The major difference, however, and here's where I want to caution making easy generalizations between, because each sanctions regime is really very different. The major difference, of course, is the DPRK already has nuclear weapons. And this has what behavioral economists call the endowment effect. It means basically that there will be a bias in favor of the status quo, because possessing something makes it more valuable than aspiring to own it. And only a high-risk gambler would stake something of high and known value for the prospect of some vague future reward. So here's what I think makes this somewhat qualitatively different from the Iran case. Strategy 3, then, just to conclude, think about combining sanctions relief with economic incentives, and I think there's a panel on that tomorrow. You could think about infrastructure projects. Roads need to be constructed to facilitate dismantling. The north-south rail links could be restored. New investment possibilities, open channels to the international financial institutions, particularly the IFC, reopen the special economic zones, offer a new development bank, perhaps a successor to CADO, and a rethinking of what went wrong and what could be corrected going forward. So to conclude, I'm really making a recommendation, I suppose, for a coordinated, carefully calibrated, tit-for-tat approach that should be developed in this situation, and will require substantial courage moves on multiple sides, with assistance certainly from the Republic of Korea. Maximum pressure, it's a phrase. Let me put on it may have reached its limits. At some point you have to decide basically when to offer concessions, how extensive the concessions should be, and the timing of those concessions. But those are just a few ideas contextualizing the idea of sanctions relief, coming up with some concrete proposals, indicating there's a very large menu to choose from, but then I leave it up to diplomats and political leaders to decide how to take this forward. And I look forward to your comments and questions. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent overview of the issue of sanctions, and I just wanted to say, of course, that North Korea has already been under sanctions for 13 years now, since 2006, and the last resolution was just approved by the Security Council to extend them for another year, and they were the same ones getting harder and harder, as you mentioned, since 2015, and they're getting more and more difficult in terms of the circumstances that North Korea is facing. I wanted to add one issue that you didn't cover, just for those who are not so familiar with the sanctions, and that is that there's always a panel of experts that is being constituted to look at the sanctions. And in the North Korean case, the first one that was instituted was in 2009, which was 3 years after the first sanctions were instituted. And this panel of experts basically looks at this, it looks at infractions, it looks at developments, and basically advises the Security Council and the committee that is constituted this time, it is under the chairmanship of Germany, to how to go forward with the sanctions. And I found it very interesting because you talked about that the DPRK was the most affected by the UN sanctions, in fact. I thought that was a very interesting comment because, of course, the UN is not involved at all in the mediation in this case. I mean, that's basically like a bifurcated path, if I can call it that, that yes, these decisions on sanctions are made in the Security Council, yet it is the South Koreans and it's President Trump who are in the driver's seat in terms of negotiations. So I find that that was very interesting. And the one other comment that I have is that sanctions I find always very difficult to lift. They're easier to impose than to lift, and I appreciate that you made a couple of comments in terms of what are the possibilities, calibrated, partial sanctions relief, etc. So those are very interesting questions that we can explore a little further. But I now wanted to give the floor to Ambassador Che, who is going to speak to more targeted issues in terms of the countries, and I'm happy to give you the floor. Please.
Thank you, Angela. Thomas gave us a framework for the UN sanctions. Building upon that basis, I am focusing on North Korean nuclear sanctions. As you know, Kim Jong-un exited in power 2011. Since he fired rockets and tested nuclear weapons, unlike his father or grandfather, he made 3 nuclear weapons tests and fired more than 85 rockets. So Trump called him Rocket Man. Then, as he accumulated nuclear and rocket tests, United Nations Security Council passed sanctions over and over. I'd like to focus on the last one, which was passed on December 22, 2017, 1.5 years ago. That was after Kim Jong-un fired Hwasong-15 on 2nd of December 2017. As you know, Hwasong is ICBM, which can attain North America. So Trump felt threatened by Hwasong missile. So he pushed China to pass the strongest possible sanctions resolution. As you know, Thomas explained that the sanctions were a workout between China and the United States, but the fact is United States tried to pass the strongest possible sanctions to suffocate North Korea, to make it to surrender for negotiation. But China, for its own reason, tried to make a limit on sanctions. That's the reality. So after Kim Jong-un tried to maximum developing ICBMs to target North Korea, China couldn't really resist much to strongest sanctions. Let me say 3 elements in Resolution 2397, which was passed again December 22nd, 2017. 3 elements. These sanctions prohibited North Korea to export any coals. Why coals? Coal is important because North Korea is autarkic economy. That doesn't trade much with other countries except China. China covers more than 70, at the time, almost 80% of trade with North Korea, and coal applies half of that export. So you can see coal export is really the source of income for Kim Jong-un. So completely stopped. North Korea cannot possibly export any coals anymore by this resolution. The second one is North Korea should call back all the North Korean workers working abroad in China, in Russia, in Middle East. They have to call back all the foreign workers, North Korean workers, in 24 months, end of this year. So that is another tight nose to Kim Jong-un, because he collected billions of dollars by North Korean workers working in foreign countries. So another very tight sanctions. The third one is most important. As Thomas mentioned, there is only a limit on North Korean import of crude oil. Why there's a limit? This is important to explain the relationship between China and the United States regarding North Korean nuclear problems. North Korea does not have any indigenous crude oil production, so it should import crude oils from abroad to make it function. Basically, the military tools does not work without crude oil import. So China provided at friendly price the minimum crude oil requirement of North Korea. So cap was fixed at 500,000 tons per year. Why this is necessary? Here you can see the difference between the United States and China on North Korean problems. The United States tried to put maximum pressure on North Korea to make it to come to negotiation and abandon nuclear weapons in the end. China has a different problem on this issue. If China block all the crude oil to North Korea, then North Korea will die. The demise of North Korea will happen in several months. People say 2-3 months North Korea will disappear because they cannot function their military tools even. In other words, China has a tool to kill North Korea, surrendering North Korea. What will happen? You are the leaders of North Korea, Kim Jong-un and others. You see China kills you in several months. That is very dangerous for China. As you know, China, despite the Singapore summit between Kim Jong-un and Trump, still has tens of nuclear weapons and medium-range missiles, SCUS and Nodong missiles. They can deliver everywhere, entire Korean peninsula, Japan, and northern part of China, including Beijing. So if you kill somebody in several months, you know what will happen to you. That is one problem. Second one, if North Korea falls apart, then millions of refugees come to China. How to deal with them? So these are a problem. And the third one is North Korea crumbles and entire North Korea comes under the influence of South Korea plus the United States. That is the line China wants to avoid. China do not want to superpower having their military powers at the border of China. So these do not allow China to completely cut the crude oil export to North Korea. So these are the key of sanctions. Since sanctions work rather, because North Korea's autarky economy depends on China basically, and when there is no sanction, South Korea's assistance and trade with Russia. So these are major three countries North Korea can depend on for economic survival. Now, without survival oil, crude oil import from China, they have no real source of income for Kim Jong-un regime. That is the reason why Hanoi summit meeting, which happened February this year, failed. There are many interpretations, but let me make it simple. The key line for the negotiation between Trump and Kim Jong-un is simple. Kim Jong-un, all he wants is relaxation of sanctions of United Nations, with which he cannot have the hard cash which he needs to sustain his regime. So all he focused for sanction relief. On the other hand, United States, having seen North Korea develop missiles and nuclear weapons, United States cannot recognize North Korea as a nuclear weapons state. If Washington agrees to relieve all the sanctions, North Korea becomes de facto nuclear weapons state, like India or Pakistan. As you know, Northeast Asia is very dangerous for nuclear weapons proliferation. There are not many other countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, who can have access to nuclear weapons in several weeks or several months. Very dangerous region for nuclear proliferation. It's absolutely necessary for the United States and China, even Russia, to prevent North Korean nuclear weapons to spread. So they all agree to eliminate North Korean nuclear weapons. So for this reason, when Kim Jong-un came to Hanoi with a card, which is not workable, I don't know why they came with this unworkable idea. They came to Kim Jong-un. Trump said that we'll abandon all nuclear facilities in Yongbyon area. Yongbyon is area near Pyongyang. They began to develop their nuclear weapons. And there are many uranium facilities as well. But Trump knew already that Yongbyon facilities represent around 40% of North Korean nuclear weapon system. 60% are across the other region. How can Trump agree to Kim Jong-un say that, okay, I accept you abandon 40% of your facilities, I relieve all the sanctions. Later, Kim Jong-un came with the apology that all he wanted was not sanction relief, but part of sanctions, but that was an apology. He really wanted eliminate all the sanctions included in the 2017 sanctions, which are vital for his regime survival. So sanction relief is vital to Kim Jong-un, and denuclearization is vital to Trump. And the card Kim Jong-un presented did not work for sanction relief. Compared to this, you can see what happened in Singapore in June 2018. They didn't discuss even the nuclear non-proliferation, the matters. They put it aside. They were not yet there. They didn't touch denuclearization, neither sanction relief. That was outside of the box. They talked only two things. Kim Jong-un promised not to fire missiles, not to have nuclear weapons test, against which Donald Trump agreed to suspend U.S.-Korea joint military exercise. So there was a mutual suspension. That was advised by Xi Jinping. That the first step for North Korean denuclearization of China, dual suspension. That was agreed upon in Singapore in 2018. That was a success, which was very good, relaxed tension in on North Korea and Northeast Asia in general. That was very good. But after that, the real problem came out, which is summarized as denuclearization of North Korean nuclear weapons versus relaxation of United Nations sanctions. Beginning July of 2018, for last 1 year, nothing happened on this score, including Hanoi summit. So you can see the visit of UN Secretary of State Pompeo visiting Pyongyang. Sometimes it worked, it didn't work, happened, and it didn't work. That is because sanction relief didn't come at all of the United States. And on the other part, Kim Jong-un never produced any comprehensive picture of nuclear weapons he possesses. So up to now, it still hangs on this critical point. Will Kim Jong-un produce at least what he has, nuclear weapons? That is first part. We may not ask his elimination from the start, but we should know how much does he have nuclear weapons in North Korea. That is starting point. Kim Jong-un is not ready to give this card. He wanted to hide something. That is another card he may have difficulty to see Xi Jinping. So if Kim Jong-un meets Xi Jinping, China will ask Kim Jong-un why Hanoi summit failed. Where do we have nuclear weapons? How much in Yongbyon? How much in other places? So Kim Jong-un cannot tell the truth, Xi Jinping, the reality of nuclear weapons in North Korea without first making this issue with Trump. So this is the key for North Korea. And across the board, let me, as a conclusion, see the difference between the United States and China. Why China cannot stop the oil supply to North Korea. And the United States, in a way, miscalculated China's influence of North Korea because they have a civilizational difference, cultural difference in dealing with their allies. Think of what happened in South Korea. In 1978, President Carter tried to withdraw United States troops from South Korea in the wake of their problem in Vietnam. So at the time, South Korean president tried to have nuclear weapons. Without American troops in South Korea, we need strong weapons, nuclear weapons. And Washington knew this attempt, and they came up with an ultimatum. You have economic development, you have nuclear weapons. You cannot have both ways. Make a choice. We could immediately make our choice. Nuclear weapons cannot in our possession. We have to focus on economic development. With that, every step, United States tried to monitor and limit our access to nuclear weapons or missile range as well as the weight. Every step. So that is American approach. They won't control their allies with the method of deduction, if you want. They have their goals, implement one after the other. I want South Korea develop economically, which was a success. Democratically, which was a success. But no nuclear weapons, no missiles. That is American approach. On the other hand, Americans do not understand China's approach. China, for 3,000 years, they never approached their allies or their neighboring countries with a deductive method. It was always inductive. Can you imagine there is no military contact between China and North Korea, even though they are allies? No military contact, nothing. And China invites the North Korean leaders show the wonderful ideas of Shanghai. This is how China works. You see the wonders of economic development come this way. So China never urged North Korea to abandon nuclear weapons and up to nuclear economic development. That is not China's work. So regarding nuclear weapons, China said many, many times, don't try to have nuclear weapons. That will be very bad for you, for us. Nobody profited from this. But North Korea tried to do this. And that is the reason why North Korea, China, America, under Obama administration, they made a mistake. Strategic patience. That means they tried to China to work on North Korea the way America worked on South Korea. That didn't work because they have civilizational differences. So they wasted 10 years, almost 10 years, waiting China to work on North Korea, which could not happen. The same way North Korea is misinterpreting America. In a way, North Korea tried to deal with America the same way they tried to deal with China. Inductive way. Let's meet. And I stopped something, and you give sanction relief. That may work with China, but not with the United States. So all in all, the situation is very, very complicated because you have sanctions problem, denuclearization, plus cultural differences between East and West, which is very difficult to realize and work on this problem. And where are we going to from here? My idea is you have to change your idea from resolution to management. In other words, with the diplomacy, you will try to resolve problems. But North Korean nuclear question is extremely complicated. And the experts say that we need at least 10 years to denuclearize North Korea, even if North Korea agrees today to nuclearize in earnest. So with such a prospect, you have to have the idea of management of North Korean problem, including the future of North Korea, rather than resolve this issue with the idea of FFVD, final and fully verified disarmament, which is verification of CCIV, complete and verifiable and irreversible disarmament. This cannot work in North Korea because you have to manage situation, not resolve this issue with inductive way. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting and presentation, and also to point out the differences between the US and China in terms of the appreciation of the issue. I also wanted to mention that I appreciate you pointing out that the 2017 resolution was really the one that kind of broke the camel's back. And one thing that one needs to keep in mind, of course, that at the time there had been very little contact, no contact really for quite some time between Kim Jong-un and, for example, China. And it was only afterwards that some diplomacy started, with China, and also he was invited to meet President Putin of the Russian Federation and so forth. So it's very interesting to see that. But I wanted to mention one issue that you pointed out, and that was and also was foreshadowed by Professor Biersteker already, about the increasingly dire situation in the DPRK itself. Now, of course, there has been quite some time already that human rights experts have said that sanctions are really, the sanction system by the UN is against human rights standards. And even though there are exemptions for humanitarian aid, the lack of financial channels is really very, very dire in terms of trying to get it through. And that was even something that was happening some years already ago with the payments by the DPRK to the United Nations regular budget, because the US was already sanctioning them for not allowing financial transactions. But we will talk a little bit about the humanitarian situation, I think, in a little while, and also the effects on North Korea. And you said that North Korea could fall apart in a couple of months, and this is what I would call the hinge effect. It was talked about the hinge in the previous session that we attended on one of the sections, and I think this is one of the hinge points that we're now approaching, not from a political point of view, but really also from the humanitarian subsistence point of view. But we can go into that a little bit more. I wanted to give now the floor to Ambassador Guillenot to talk about EU and sanctions. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. And I would like to answer, or try to answer, three questions. My first question, I will be brief because Professor Bistaker already said much about it, with what can we expect from sanctions? Second, what are the interests of Europe? And third, what can be the contribution of Europe? On the first point, I would take it from a political angle to complement what Professor Bistaker said. Looking at the sanctions regime, the various sanction regime when I was working at the UN, my feeling is that too often the Security Council turns to sanction because it wants to do something and doesn't know what to do. And that's a very dangerous way to look at sanctions, but that is often the reason why it looks at sanctions. And the experiences, and I think the research of your research in a way confirms that in most of the time it doesn't work, and then when it works, it's when it is very focused with a limited goal. And the challenge in the case of North Korea is that the goal became, in a way, there was a kind of panic when the resolution was adopted in December 2017. There was a sense of catastrophic development being possible, and that was a reality. Myself, I remember being in China in December 2017, before the resolution was adopted, and I think in Beijing there was a palpable sense of not panic but real concern about what the United States would do. And one could say that President Trump at least succeeded in using, I don't know if it was by design, but the sense of unpredictability of what was going to happen. Certainly in China there was much concern about the fallout for China of a war, the catastrophic consequences of that. And I think it is in that context that the resolution could be adopted that went beyond what most resolutions have done, I think even beyond some of the Iraq resolutions, with the risk that Angela Kane and Ambassador Choi mentioned, that with preventing exports for Korea that would starve Korea of cash. If you add to that at the end of this year, with no more remittances, that would be another turn of the screw on receipts. And if you, on the other side, you have no oil products, and there the European Union actually goes beyond the UN sanction. It takes the position that the West wanted, that Western powers wanted the Security Council to take, but the Security Council, under pressure from China and Russia, didn't go as far as the West wanted. But the result, although food products are excluded, but because there is oil in some of the inputs needed for agriculture, including fertilizers, that means that it has an impact on food production in the DPRK. So this is a regime that goes very, very far, and I think the experience is that if you try sanctions that pose an existential threat to a regime, then it doesn't work, because it's a question, it becomes such a fundamental issue that so-called blunt instrument of sanctions does not operate anymore. And that's the situation with the sanction regime as it exists since the end of 2017, in the last edition of 2017. Now, what are the interests of Europe in that situation? Well, of course, in the six-party talks, there were no European power except Russia, and one could say at a superficial level that Europe is a very long way from the Korean Peninsula and that there is no direct European interest. That would be actually deeply wrong. It's wrong first because there are two permanent members of the Security Council, the UK and France, that of course have a direct responsibility in deciding the sanctions and or blocking them if they disagreed. There are European powers which have which have shown real interest in the issue. I mean, just before this forum, I was in Sweden attending the board of CIPRI, and certainly Sweden and institutes like CIPRI have shown great interest, have tried to help the situation. So there is that interest. But at a strategic level, there are two fundamental European interests. One is the question of non-proliferation. That is a global issue, and non-proliferation also as part of a rule-based order. If a non-proliferation regime falls apart, this has worldwide consequences that affect, of course, directly East Asia, but affect the whole world. And that is, of course, very important for all European powers. And that's why Europe actually played a leading role in the negotiation of the JCPOA, the so-called E3. France, Germany, and the United Kingdom played a very important role, as did the High Representative in helping bring together the various perspectives, because there was a perception that if proliferation happened in the Middle East, that would trigger a catastrophic chain of events. And to this day, Europe is fighting for the survival of the JCPOA in spite of the withdrawal of the US. I think there's a second important interest of Europe, which I would say is the humanitarian interest. Europe, the Europeans, as a matter of principle, don't believe in starving people to achieve policy aims. And so there is an important question in how to deal with the situation in the Korean Peninsula in a way that is not going to create extreme hardship for the people living in the DPRK. Then there is and I think these two interests are the most important. The first one, of course, being fundamental in terms of international relations. Then there is a third interest that one should not underestimate, is the relations with the United States, which is important to any country in the world, and of course important strategically to European countries with the Atlantic Alliance and the strategic relationship between the Europeans and the United States. And there it has two aspects. One is that the Europeans, on an issue that is important to the United States, will not want to have a frontal collision with the United States and shares many of the goals of the United States on the issue. At the same time, they are worried by the overreach of the US in a number of situations, including now on the Iran issue. The way national American sanctions, and I'm not go way beyond UN sanctions, and create an and abuse extraterritoriality, and so try to impose what are sometimes US policies rather than UN sanction policies. And there is an issue which is about the organization of international relations, whether we live in a world where unilateral decisions by a powerful country leveraging access to its market can really change the international context, or whether you base international relations on the principle of cooperation and therefore cannot impose your policy to the rest of the world. So in that context, my third question, what can the Europeans do? First, I think stress the fact that sanctions should not punish people for the misdeeds of their leaders. That is something that is, of course, not so easy to reconcile with the need to signal to the regime in Pyongyang that the behavior is unacceptable. But accepting the enormous hardship that, in that respect, 2019 could be a perfect storm for the DPRK, because when you combine the fact that there were bad crops in 2018, the additional now, the end of remittances, and the squeeze on exports, the squeeze on imports that are important for the for the North Korean economy, the picture is catastrophically bleak. And the notion that a collapse would be a good thing, this is certainly something that no European country would buy. At the same time, certainly we all have learned the lessons of the Oil for Food program, that is to sort of tailor a complex regime to try to protect the people from the consequences of sanctions, doesn't work. So there's not going to be the equivalent on an Oil for Food program in the case of the DPRK. And so there we are stuck. But that consideration that you cannot just turn the screw more and more to the point of the risk of regime collapse, I think there the Europeans would share the vision of China, and I think of South Korea, the Republic of Korea, that this is not a sound policy. What can be done then? Of course, there could be a more liberal interpretation of the exemptions, as Professor Birter reminded us. But that will go only so far. At the end of the day, the key is to resume the political process. How do we get out of the trap in which the negotiation fell in Hanoi? Of course, the interpretation of the failure is a complex one, and I will not claim to certainly know more than Ambassador Choi, and I'll be very cautious on that. What strikes me is that when you read the transcript of a conversation, of a speech that the U.S. envoy had at Stanford University in January of this year, you can see that in the U.S. administration there was a willingness to approach the issue with gradualism. When asked a pointed question on whether sanctions could be lifted only once there had been complete denuclearization, the envoy, without denying that, because this is a formal position, has a very subtle answer that almost suggests a certain gradualism. Because it's clear that in Hanoi, the combination of a demand by Kim Jong-un to trade one nuclear facility for a comprehensive lifting of sanction was obviously not a realistic proposal. The document that apparently was handed over by the U.S. delegation to the DPRK delegation was also not a realistic proposition. The notion that DPRK would, at the beginning of a negotiation, hand over a complete list, a comprehensive list of its nuclear facilities. That is the traditional position of the US, but in the context, in the existing context, that is like handing over a target list. There was no chance whatsoever that this would happen, and a number of experts have condemned that move as something that could only torpedo the negotiation. And we have seen recent declarations in Japan, actually, of declaration tweets, because that's the new diplomacy, of President Trump on the issue. There seem to be differences between his national security advisor and himself on that issue. So when you look at these two elements, you get a sense that in a way a more subtle approach could have produced results. And the question now is a question of faith. It's a question of finding a way from moving away from a misstep, fundamental misstep by the DPRK leadership, and a misstep or maneuver engineered by some on the US side, which could also only torpedo the negotiation. The Europeans are not going to change that. But they can help by stressing that indeed there is a way forward. This is up to the parties directly interested, the Republic of Korea, the DPRK, and the US, to really make the move. The Europeans cannot do it, but they can help maybe also by developing ideas for the future and giving them some flesh. I was struck by what former US commander in Korea, General Brooks, said at Asia Society in New York when he suggested to create a fund whose monies could be operationalized once there had been a movement. The question is, how do you show to the DPRK leadership that if they take another course, then there are prospects for serious economic development and international cooperation in the DPRK. And making that prospect more concrete, then can maybe create the momentum that will be required. I will stop there, concluding as a Frenchman, thinking, I mean, I am of a generation that was born after World War II, but I've read history books, and my parents were involved in that war. And what one can say is that indeed reconciliation and peace are not an event, they are a process. In the 50s in my country, it required some vision and leadership to bring Germany and France where they are today, which was unthinkable in the immediate aftermath of World War II. So I think what appears unthinkable today may well be the reality of tomorrow if we proceed in a gradual, methodical, and systematic way, but with a clear vision of what the future should be.
Thank you very much for another very interesting exposure of how it looks from the European side, and I appreciate the points of view that you've put forward. What worries me a little bit is that you say, and you compare that to like Germany and France, and that was a years or decades long process, and of course that time is not available in North Korea, as we have also heard. The projections are right now that the capability, capability of the DPRK, the export capability will shrink by 90%, no money available, and due to the lack of imports, particularly of petroleum exports, you don't have chemical fertilizers, you don't have petroleum or gas for machinery, etc., etc. So in addition to the poor climate and the disastrous harvest already had, I think that we're facing, as you said, a perfect storm. I find it interesting that the sanctions were discussed in Hanoi, but on the other hand, those sanctions are not only by the US, but also on the Security Council, so that should have been really a much larger involvement of others. Now, I'm looking at the clock, and I think that there are probably a good number of questions in the audience, so I will hold mine for the time being, and I will turn it over to the audience to follow up on the questions to these very, very interesting presentations. Now, I can't really see in the back, so I need to have someone wave at me or something if there's someone in the back. Plus, the lights are all of a sudden very dim. Maybe we can have higher lights? I don't know who turned them off, maybe inadvertently. Could we have the lights on, please? Well, while this is being addressed, thank you very much. Please, if you have a question. Yes, I don't know, do we have a microphone? Yes, would you introduce yourself? And if the question is directed at any of the panelists in particular, please say so.
Thank you. I'm Jeffrey Schott from the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington. And one of the issues that was not covered by the panel in great detail was not the form of sanctions or the comprehensiveness of sanctions, but whether the implementation of sanctions has been effective. One of the strategies of a target regime is to negotiate away or to evade the sanctions. And most of the time, target regimes find ways of evading because there are economic incentives to doing so. So you can plan the most comprehensive regime as you want, and the comprehensive regime against Saddam Hussein was more comprehensive than the ones against North Korea, I would argue. And yet Saddam Hussein smuggled $2 billion worth of goods in and out of his country every year. Is there an indication of how much, or how well the sanctions are, or how effective the implementation has been? Because that is really the key to whether sanctions can put the requisite pressure. And on the other side, I think the panel was also very importantly noting the problem of when you have effective implementation, then the people are hurt because there are no effective means of providing humanitarian assistance because of the financial constraints, and that's happened in many countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? Then we can take two together. Yes, please, here in the front, and then the gentleman on the left, please.
Jung Guyan from Seoul, Korea. Following up on the previous question, I am a little confused about the role of China in your discussions. I think Mr. Biersteck mentioned China and U.S. cooperated in putting these sanctions on, but strategically thinking, China will never afford to lose North Korea, in a sense, because North Korea is a buffer state for China. So China may go along with the U.S., but China can be also backdoor. So I like to more clarification about the China's role in these sanctions on North Korea. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we give the microphone to the gentleman on your right.
Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. Also, thank you to the moderator. I would like to ask two questions.
Introduce yourself, please.
Oh, yeah. My name is Boris Kondoch. I'm the editor of the Journal of International Peacekeeping, and I'm also teaching at a small countryside university here in Korea. I have two questions from the perspective of international law, and I would like to know from our experts whether they think the current sanctions regime is in violations of human rights. We mentioned they already have a negative impact on ordinary North Koreans. The other question is related to implementation. I mean, one of the problems we seems to have is that Russia and China are not too eager implementing the sanction. Is there any kind of mechanism how you can hold members of the Security Council accountable for not implementing their own sanctions? Thank you.
Very interesting questions we've had. So let me turn. Could I ask you first, Thomas, what you take on? And then we just go this round.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Interesting set of questions, and I could go on for a long time on each. But let me start with Jeffrey Schott's question about implementation. Has it been effective? Every sanctions regime is basically it's a prohibition regime, and as soon as you apply a prohibition, you create powerful material and economic incentives to evade those measures. You can make a fortune if you're effective in evading these measures. So that's just a principle of sanctions in general. So evasion is always the case, and the interesting thing in terms of implementation is to what extent are they effectively going to be implemented? How effective is the evasion? Angela mentioned earlier the important role of the monitoring teams, and I've worked closely with a number of the monitoring teams, especially the DPRK, and we just had a meeting, as I said earlier, this month in New York. Their latest report is very interesting. For those of you who don't read UN monitoring team reports, and they're usually in hundreds of page versions, this one's relatively short, at least the main text. And the argument from the monitoring team is that implementation has been very ineffective. There's been extraordinary evasion, particularly in ship-to-ship transfers of oil. So the petroleum embargo has been exceeded. The limit on the petroleum imports has already been exceeded. They've also presented very interesting information on the systematic nature. I mentioned earlier the command nature. This is really the last command economy. North Korean diplomats are actively involved in assisting the evasion of the financial sanctions through a variety of different mechanisms that's also laid out in this latest report. And there's even a direct link to cyber attacks. That is a systematic attack on the SWIFT system, which happened last year, was coordinated in, I think, 40 different or 30 or 40 different jurisdictions on the same day through North Korean diplomats. So here's a regime that is extraordinarily good at evading measures. So implementation is and so clearly this is not yet at the let's negotiate, but obviously there is an interest in negotiation. If sanctions are so ineffective, then why is there so much focus on sanctions relief? I mean, I just asked that question rhetorically, but I think you raise a very important point about the powerful incentive to cheat and how effective the implementation has been. With regard to humanitarian challenges, that's also something that I was going to comment earlier on a point about Jean-Marie's very important point about the European view, but I think it's a global view. Sanctions should not harm innocent people. The whole idea of publics that have no ability to influence their governments, it's actually, and that would be a human rights violation in a sense, if you're actually punishing people for a government they have relatively limited or no influence over. But that's the whole reason the instrument of targeted sanctions was developed in the first place. And it was really out of the debacle over the humanitarian crisis in Iraq, when in fact there was well-documented significant consequences of the comprehensive sanctions. So the move toward targeted sanctions, which really took off in the early 2000s, following the Interlaken, the Bonn Berlin, the Stockholm processes, all of these efforts to try to develop the instrument. But at the moment, I think we're facing a new crisis or challenge, and it's really the challenge of keeping targeted sanctions targeted. Because what is happening globally, and this is in particular in the DPRK case, it doesn't matter if there are humanitarian exemptions to bring goods into Korea at the moment, but in fact, banks refuse to authorize the payments. Banks are so worried about compliance and are probably over-complying, de-risking. And it's not just in Korea, it's happening in a number of other cases. It's happening in Yemen, it's happening in Somalia, certainly it's happened in Iran historically. So and it's happening in Syria in a very significant way, that some of us are involved in active negotiations about how to create safe banking channels that will give banks the confidence to, in fact, avoid this and to allow the exemption system, which is in place, allow it to function and work. I have opinions about the other questions, but I don't want to go on too long, so I'll come back later. Thanks.
Let me just mention one issue, and that is that every approval for an exemption to the sanction has to go also through the committee. And that means that these approvals can be backlogged. And I think it was Stephen Began, you mentioned him already in his speech in Stanford at the end of January. And he basically said, we're clearing the backlog and we're making progress, etc. But on the other hand, the one issue that is very interesting, when you read all of the sanctions resolution, there's always one paragraph in there. And that says that they always reiterate that the DPRK carries the main responsibility for keeping the welfare of its people. And that, of course, goes directly against SDG Goal 2, and that is zero hunger. So there is always a contradiction in all of these issues when you look at them. But that was just an addition to what you said, Thomas. Hyung-jin.
I think it's reasonable to question the effectiveness of UN sanctions on North Korea, especially involving China. You can read here and there newspapers from Japan or America that sometimes the relaxation on the part of China towards North Korea, sometimes they say China does respect UN sanctions. But my conclusion is that when I contact Chinese experts, in general, China does implement the UN sanctions, including the withdrawal of North Korean workers in China by the end of this year. They are working on this. In general, that's the attitude. The proof is, look at North Korea. They really focus on sanctions relief since Singapore summit. Everything failed. They are so mad. Now they ended all the conversation in South Korea because South Korea couldn't deliver sanctions relief to Kim Jong-un. So they are really clinging to this because several $1 billion are important for regime survival. As you know, before Kim Jong-un, his father focused on military-first policy. Strange idea, but he tried to regime survival and military support. So he gave everything to military. But Kim Jong-un, when he had the power 2011, he realized that military is not sufficient to regime survival. He must feed the people. So he changed the slogan from military first to military plus economy, so-called Byungjin line. So economy is so important for his survival, his own survival. So he relaxed economic reforms. He implemented economic reforms, such as he gave some slot to each farmers. They can produce things the same way Soviet Union did on their farmers. They can open the market. They had over 50,000 markets here and there they can sell and have some incomes. And North Korean economy grew around 3 to 4% the last 7 years, which is great. But his future is not dependent on nuclear weapons. His future depends on economic development. He showed the path to the people. He cannot satisfy the demand. He will face the great problem for his regime survival. So it's not nuclear weapons, it's the economy which will decide the North Korean regime. Think about the difference between South and North Korea. We did sunshine policy for 10 years with maximum effort. Kim Dae-jung, Roh Moo-hyun did great well. But what happened afterwards? This government, 1.5 years, great sunshine policy, nothing happened. Look at what happened in Taiwan and mainland China. They have $200 billion of trade between the two. What happened in South Korea and North Korea? Nothing, no trade at all. They have 1/10 10 million people visiting each other between Taiwan, China. Who can visit from South Korea, North Korea, from North Korea, South Korea? Not a single one. There are over 900 direct flights per week between Taiwan and China. How many direct flights from South Korea and North Korea? Nothing. So whatever you try to mobilize North Korea, economic development is your survival, they are in dilemma. They cannot abandon the military. The regime collapse. They cannot opt for nuclear weapons, reform and opening up. Regime will collapse. So they are in mortal dilemma between the two. So my question, which I would like to share with you, it is not about effectiveness sanctions or not. They are there. But whether North Korea can make a decision between South Korea, the nuclear weapons and economy, that is the key. We have to surmise that North Korea may be unable to make a choice. So our problem, that becomes our problem. How we deal with North Korea, which remain unable to make a choice between nuclear weapons and economic development. That is a key question. And my answer is you have to manage the problem, looking at what happened economically in North Korea, in Kim Jong-un regime, and we have to take the view of management rather than resolution.
Thank you very much. And Jean-Marie, over to you.
Well, on the position of China, I would agree that on the whole, China has respected the sanctions, especially in the recent period, quite well. But at the end of the day, if China saw that the full implementation of sanctions would risk a kind of cataclysmic situation in DPRK, probably China will do whatever is needed to prevent that from happening. And that brings me to my second point on China. I think the very bad scenario for China would be a situation of unification of the peninsula with leading to an ally of the United States on its border. That is not something that probably China looks forward to. China would probably prefer to have a manageable status quo, where there is a DPRK that does not collapse, that ideally moves toward a slow denuclearization or an indefinite freeze, and grows economically, where it makes a choice that maybe it cannot make, but stays separate, doesn't unify with the ROK, because that would create a whole set of different challenges for China. So I think there is a strong interest of China in avoiding a development that would bring a certain strategic instability in the region. That's probably the course that China wants to pursue. Is it then the question is the policy of sanction a violation of human rights? Yeah, if it leads to massive hardship for people who have no responsibility in the situation that generates the sanctions, yes, collective punishment is not something that is in conformity with human rights. Collective punishment is in all legal systems something that is not considered legitimate.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just looking at the clock. I was hoping to have another round, but with 40 seconds to go, I'm afraid that we can't do this. When I look at the discussion that we've had, and I really think we've had excellent presentations, I think that we're now at a very worrying intersection of politics, economics, and the world situation, really. And I think that it's been called either a perfect storm, I think that was your word, Jean-Marie, or it was called a hinge point. And the only positive that I can really see at this point is that the meeting in Hanoi, even though it's considered, quote, a failure, the two leaders did not accuse each other of, or did not have recriminations about each other. So I think there is the possibility that there would be another summit coming. There's also diplomacy coming from Japan. I think the Prime Minister has just agreed that he would meet with Kim Jong-un. So I think that there's a lot more dialogue that's going. There's a lot more meeting of opportunities for dialogue, occasions of dialogue. Of course, South Korea has always been extremely a forerunner in this issue, and so it should, as its neighbor. But on the other hand, I think that we're not over the hump, and we will have some very worrying moments. And we must keep in mind that, after all, it is the non-proliferation issue that's really at the heart of all of this. And the lessons from history, whether it's the JCPOA or whether it's Iraq, even though they didn't have weapons of mass destruction, is a very worrisome that we can think of. With that, I would ask you to give a big, big hand to our excellent panelists, and I thank you all for being here.